I remember exactly where I was sitting when my stepfather said those words that would change everything. It was at my nephew's birthday celebration at the fancy country club in Maplewood Heights. The whole Hartwell family was gathered around. The mahogany table in the private dining room, crystal glasses catching the chandelier light, expensive suits and designer dresses, the kind of gathering where everyone speaks in hushed, respectful tones about stock portfolios and vacation, homes in the Hamptons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My stepfather, Richard Hartwell, sat at the head of the table, like he always did, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured with his wine glass. He was giving one of his speeches about family legacy and tradition, about how proud he was of the Hartwell name and all the achievements we'd accomplished together as a unit. I was there with my son Marcus, who had just turned 18 2 weeks earlier. Marcus sat beside me in his best dress shirt, the one I'd bought him from the clearance rack at Macy's, trying to blend into the background the way he always did at these family gatherings. He was quiet, polite, uncomfortable in his own skin around all this wealth and prestige that somehow never quite extended to us. Just 3 days earlier, Marcus had received his acceptance letter to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Full-ride academic scholarship, plus additional grants for his groundbreaking research proposal in renewable energy engineering. My son, who had spent every weekend for the past 2 years working at the local hardware store to help pay our bills, who studied by candlelight when our electricity got shut off, who built a solar panel system in our tiny apartment that actually worked. He had made it to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. I was bursting with pride, practically vibrating with excitement to share this news with the family. This was it. This was our moment. After years of being treated like the poor relations, the afterthoughts, the ones who got invited out of obligation rather than genuine affection, we finally had something that would make them see us differently. So when Richard paused in his speech and asked if anyone had family news to share, I cleared my throat and spoke up. "Actually," I said, my voice trembling slightly with excitement, "Marcus just got accepted to MIT with a full academic scholarship. We're incredibly proud of him." The table went quiet for a moment. A few polite murmurs of congratulations. Richard nodded slowly, then looked directly at Marcus with that calculating expression he got when he was doing mental arithmetic about money. "MIT," he said thoughtfully. "That's expensive. Even with a scholarship, there are living expenses. Books, all those extra costs." He paused, swirling his wine. "I suppose you'll be needing help with the college fund we set up for the family." My heart leaped. The Hartwell Family College Fund. I'd heard whispers about it for years. A substantial trust fund that Richard had established to help family members with higher education. My stepbrother's kids had all benefited from it. My stepsister's daughter had used it for her art degree at a private college in California. That would be incredible, I started to say, but Richard held up his hand. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each of the other family members, then back at Marcus. And that's when he said it, the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "Actually, I don't think that would be appropriate. The fund is for legitimate family members who are going to make something of themselves. Marcus is a smart kid, sure, but let's be honest here. He's not really Hartwell material. He doesn't have the breeding, the connections, the foundation that success requires. It would be a waste of resources that could go to someone who can actually represent the family name properly." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I'd been slapped. Not just me, Marcus. My brilliant, hard-working, extraordinary son had just been dismissed as not Hartwell material by a man who had married into this family just like I had, who had no more claim to the Hartwell name than we did. I looked at Marcus, expecting to see hurt, embarrassment, maybe tears. But what I saw was something else entirely. His jaw was set, his eyes were cold, and there was a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth that I didn't recognize. It wasn't sadness I saw in his face. It was calculation. He nodded politely, said, "I understand," and went back to quietly eating his overpriced salmon. But I knew my son, and I knew that look. Richard Hartwell had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus had been planning something special for his graduation ceremony. Something that would involve the entire Hartwell family, the whole community, and a microphone. Something that would make Richard's dismissive words come back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. You see, being rejected from the family college fund wasn't the end of Marcus's story. It was just the beginning. And by the time my son was finished, Richard Hartwell would wish he'd never opened his mouth that night at the country club. But before I tell you about the perfect revenge that Marcus orchestrated, and trust me, it was absolutely perfect, you need to understand how we got to this point. You need to understand what it's like to be an outsider in your own family, to watch your child be treated as less than simply because he doesn't fit their narrow definition of success. This is the story of how my son turned Richard Hartwell's greatest insult into his most spectacular triumph. And when you hear what Marcus did on that graduation stage, you'll understand why even now, months later, Richard still can't look me in the eye at family gatherings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Victoria Chen, and I've been fighting for my place in the Hartwell family for 12 long years. Not fighting in the loud, dramatic way that makes for good television, but fighting in that quiet, exhausting way that slowly chips away at your soul. The kind of fighting where you smile and nod and say thank you when someone hands you scraps and calls it generosity. I married into this family when Marcus was 6 years old. His biological father had walked out when Marcus was just 2, leaving us with nothing but a pile of medical bills and a broken lease on a studio apartment in downtown Riverside. When I met Richard at a charity fundraiser where I was working as a caterer, I thought I'd found salvation. A successful investment banker, widowed, lonely, looking for companionship and maybe something real. Richard seemed charmed by Marcus in those early days. He'd ruffle his hair, buy him little gifts, tell people about my new son with what seemed like genuine pride. I thought we were building something beautiful together. I thought Marcus would finally have the father figure he deserved, and I would finally have the security I'd been chasing since my own father died when I was 15. What I didn't realize was that Richard collected people the way he collected antique watches, as status symbols, conversation pieces, things that made him look good in the right light. And like all collectors, he had very specific ideas about what was valuable and what was disposable. Marcus, even at 6, was extraordinary. Not in the loud, show-off way that gets you noticed at parties, but in the quiet, intense way that changes the world. He would spend hours taking apart old electronics I'd find at garage sales, figuring out how they worked, then putting them back together better than before. By age 8, he was reading college-level textbooks on engineering that he'd check out from the library. By 10, he was building robots out of spare parts that actually functioned. But Richard's version of success wasn't about innovation or intelligence. It was about appearances, connections, saying the right things to the right people at the right cocktail parties. Marcus didn't fit that mold. He was too serious, too focused, too real for Richard's carefully curated world. The Hartwell family gatherings became a monthly reminder of exactly where we stood in the hierarchy. Richard's biological son from his first marriage, Jonathan, was the golden child. Prep school educated, captain of the lacrosse team. Everything handed to him. On a silver platter? He'd graduated from Yale with a business degree and immediately landed a position at his father's firm, not because he was brilliant, but because he was a Hartwell. Then there was Richard's daughter, Sophia, 25 and already married to another investment banker. She lived in a penthouse in Manhattan, spent her days shopping and going to charity luncheons, and spoke about her little projects, a boutique jewelry line that lost money every quarter but kept her busy. And then, there were Marcus and me, the add-ons, the second-tier family members who got invited to birthdays and holidays, but never quite belonged. We lived in the same house as Richard, sure, but in the guest wing. We ate dinner together most nights, but Marcus and I always cleared the table while the real Hartwells retired to the study for brandy and business talk. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that Marcus was getting opportunities he never would have had otherwise, private tutors when he needed help with advanced mathematics, access to Richard's extensive library, connections that might help him later in life. I convinced myself that being grateful was more important than being equal. But Marcus saw everything. He watched Jonathan get a brand new BMW for his 16th birthday, while Marcus got a used Honda Civic from the dealership's backlot. He noticed that Sophia's college graduation party had 200 guests and a live band, while Marcus's high school graduation got a dinner at the local steakhouse with just the immediate family. He never complained. That wasn't Marcus's way. Instead, he channeled everything into his work, his studies, his relentless pursuit of something bigger than the small box they'd tried to put him in. While Jonathan was partying at Yale, Marcus was working 16-hour days between school, his part-time job, and his research projects. When the MIT acceptance letter arrived, I cried for 20 minutes in the kitchen, not just because I was proud, though I was bursting with pride, but because I finally had proof. Proof that my son was extraordinary, proof that he belonged at the top of any room he walked into, proof that the Hartwell family's casual dismissal of him had been wrong all along. I thought that letter would change everything. I thought it would finally make them see Marcus the way I saw him, as brilliant, as worthy, as deserving of every opportunity they'd given their biological children without question. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most humiliating moment of our lives. Richard's words at that country club dinner weren't just a rejection of financial support. They were a rejection of Marcus as a person, a dismissal of everything he'd worked for, a declaration that in Richard's mind, Marcus would never be good enough to call himself a Hartwell. But what Richard didn't understand, what he never understood, was that Marcus had never wanted to be a Hartwell. He'd spent 12 years watching this family from the inside, studying their weaknesses, understanding their priorities, learning exactly how their world worked. And now, with MIT in his future and nothing left to lose, he was finally ready to show them what they'd been overlooking all these years. He was ready to prove that being Hartwell material was the smallest thing he could aspire to be. The quiet, observant boy who had spent years taking apart machines to understand how they worked was about to take apart the Hartwell family's carefully constructed image. And unlike those childhood electronics projects, when Marcus was finished, he had no intention of putting it back together. The real story began 14 years ago in a cramped emergency room in downtown Riverside, where I held my 3-year-old son against my chest while a doctor explained that his father had been in a car accident. Not the kind of accident where you walk away with whiplash and a good story. The kind where the police show up at your door at midnight and everything you thought you knew about your life disappears in a single sentence. Marcus's father, David, had been driving home from his second job at the warehouse when a drunk driver ran a red light. David died instantly, they said, which was supposed to be some kind of comfort. No suffering, they meant. But what they didn't understand was that the suffering was just beginning for the rest of us. David hadn't been perfect. We'd married young, maybe too young, and money was always tight. But he loved Marcus with the fierce, protective love that only fathers seem capable of. He'd spend hours on the living room floor building elaborate block towers with Marcus, teaching him about balance and engineering principles without realizing that's what he was doing. "Look, buddy," he'd say, See how if you put the weight here, the whole thing falls down? But if you distribute it like this. After the funeral, the bills started arriving like a slow-motion avalanche. Medical debt from the emergency room visit, funeral expenses, car payments on a vehicle that was now a twisted pile of metal in some junkyard. David's life insurance policy turned out to be worth about as much as the paper it was printed on. The company found some technicality about his part-time warehouse job and denied the claim. I was 24 years old, with a 3-year-old son, a high school diploma, and absolutely no idea how to survive. We lost the apartment first, then moved in with my sister Karen in her 1-bedroom place across town. Marcus slept on the couch, I slept on the floor, and every night I lay awake wondering how long we could keep this up. That's when I started, working for Elegant Affairs, the catering company that serviced all the high-end events in Maplewood Heights. It wasn't glamorous work. I spent most of my time in industrial kitchens preparing food that cost more per plate than I made in a week. But it was steady money, and sometimes there were tips. The charity fundraiser where I met Richard was supposed to be just another job. The Riverside Children's Hospital annual gala, $500 a plate, held at the Maplewood Country Club. I was working the silent auction table, helping guests navigate the bidding process for weekend getaways and spa packages that cost more than my monthly rent. Richard approached the table around 9 o'clock, after most of the serious bidding was done. He was alone, which struck me as odd. Everyone else seemed to be coupled up. Power couples in designer clothes discussing vacation homes and stock options. But Richard stood by himself, studying the auction items with the same intensity Marcus brought to his engineering books. "The fishing trip to Alaska," he said without looking up. "Have you been?" I almost laughed. "Not exactly in my budget," I said, then immediately regretted it. You weren't supposed to remind the guests that you were poor. It made them uncomfortable. But Richard smiled. Mine either, until recently. I remember when a trip to the state, fare was a major family expense. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt something I hadn't felt since David died. Seen. We talked for 20 minutes while I should have been working. He told me about growing up in rural Ohio, about working 3 jobs to put himself through college, about building his investment firm from nothing. I told him about Marcus, about his incredible intelligence, about how I worried constantly that I wasn't giving him the opportunities he deserved. "Bring him by sometime," Richard said as the evening was winding down. "I'd like to meet this genius son of yours." The courtship was like something out of a fairy tale, at least in the beginning. Richard would pick us up in his Mercedes and take us to places I'd only seen in magazines. Art museums, symphony concerts, restaurants where the waiters wore white gloves. Marcus was enchanted by it all, but not in the way you'd expect from a 6-year-old. He wasn't impressed by the fancy cars or expensive meals. He was fascinated by the systems, the logistics, the way everything worked. At the symphony, while other kids fidgeted in their seats, Marcus studied the orchestra like it was a complex machine. "How do they all know when to start?" he whispered to Richard. "How does the conductor make them all play the same speed?" Richard was charmed, genuinely charmed. He started bringing Marcus books about music theory, about acoustics, about the physics of sound. He set up a small laboratory in the guest room of his house where Marcus could conduct experiments. For 6 months, I thought we'd found our happy ending. The proposal came on Marcus's 7th birthday. Richard had organized a party at Chuck E. Cheese, not because it was his kind of place, but because he thought it's what Marcus would want. But Marcus spent the entire party in the corner, dismantling one of the broken arcade games with a screwdriver he'd somehow acquired, trying to figure out why it wasn't working properly. "Your son is remarkable," Richard said to me as we watched. Marcus successfully repaired the game and then explained to the manager exactly what had been wrong with the circuit board. "I want to give him everything. I want to give both of you everything." The wedding was small, elegant, held in Richard's backyard overlooking the lake. Marcus was our ring bearer, serious and focused in his tiny tuxedo, treating the ceremony like an important scientific procedure that required his complete attention. I wore a dress that cost more than my car, and for the first time in years, I felt beautiful. But fairy tales have a way of revealing their true nature once the wedding cake is eaten and the guests go home. The Hartwell family had very specific expectations about how their newest members should behave, and those expectations didn't include a 7-year-old who preferred building robots to playing sports, or a new wife who still sometimes lapsed into the casual speech patterns of her working-class upbringing. The first family gathering was a formal dinner party to introduce Marcus and me to Richard's extended family: brothers, sisters, cousins, the whole Hartwell clan. I spent hours getting ready, making sure Marcus's hair was perfect, rehearsing answers to questions they might ask about my background. But within 5 minutes of arriving, I realized we were being evaluated. Not welcomed, evaluated. Richard's sister Margaret asked me pointed questions about my education, my family history, my previous circumstances. Richard's brother Thomas spent the entire evening testing Marcus, asking him math problems and science. Questions like he was auditioning for a role in the family. Marcus passed every test they threw at him, of course, but I could see in their faces that passing wasn't enough. He was smart, yes, but he wasn't their kind of smart. He was intense where they valued casual confidence. He was curious where they prized social polish. He was everything I loved about him, and nothing they understood. That night, as we drove home in Richard's Mercedes, Marcus was quiet in the back seat. Finally, he spoke up. "Mom, why were they asking me all those questions?" I caught Richard's eye in the rearview mirror. He looked uncomfortable, guilty even. "They just wanted to get to know you, sweetheart," I said. But Marcus, even at 7, was too smart to accept that explanation. "It felt like a test," he said quietly. "Did I pass?" That question haunted me for years afterward, because the truth was that Marcus would spend the next 11 years taking that same test over and over again. And no matter how brilliantly he performed, no matter what he achieved, the answer would always be the same. In the Hartwell family, passing was never going to be enough for a boy who'd started life as an outsider. The discrimination didn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It crept in like water through cracks, subtle and persistent, until one day you realize you're drowning in a flood of small cruelties that nobody else seems to notice. It started with Christmas morning when Marcus was 8. The Hartwell family had a tradition of opening presents in order of age, youngest to oldest, with everyone gathered in the formal living room while Richard played patriarch from his leather armchair. Jonathan, Richard's biological son who was then 15, had a mountain of elaborately wrapped gifts piled beside the tree. Sophia, 13 at the time, had nearly as many. Marcus had 3 presents, 3 small boxes wrapped in leftover paper from my own childhood stash, because apparently the expensive wrapping paper in Richard's hall closet was reserved for real family members. One gift was a basic calculator. Practical, Richard had said, for a boy who liked numbers. The second was a sweater that was clearly from the sale rack, still had the clearance sticker partially scraped off. The third was a book about famous inventors, the kind you find in the bargain bin at chain bookstores. Meanwhile, Jonathan unwrapped the latest gaming system, a professional skateboard, designer clothes, and an envelope containing $500 in cash for whatever catches. "Your eye, son." Sophia received jewelry, art supplies, concert tickets, and her own matching envelope of spending money. Marcus opened each of his gifts with the same polite smile, said thank you in that careful voice he used around Richard's family, and never once asked why Santa seemed to have different budgets for different children in the same household. But I saw it. I saw the way he studied Jonathan's pile of gifts with that analytical expression he got when he was trying to understand how something worked. I saw him calculating, measuring, filing away information about his place in this family's hierarchy. The birthday parties were worse. Jonathan's 16th birthday was a massive affair. 40 of his friends, a DJ, catered food, and that brand new BMW sitting in the driveway with a giant red bow. The party lasted 6 hours and probably cost more than I made in 3 months at the catering company. Marcus's 16th birthday fell on a Tuesday. Richard was traveling for business, a last-minute trip that seemed to coincide remarkably well with Marcus's special day. We celebrated with dinner at Applebee's, just the two of us, while Richard sent a text message from whatever airport he was sitting in. "Sorry, kiddo. Make it up to you when I get back." He never did make it up to him. The academic achievements were perhaps the most painful to watch. When Jonathan made honor roll his junior year, barely scraping B's in regular classes, Richard threw a celebration dinner at the country club and invited extended family to toast Jonathan's academic excellence. When Marcus won the state science fair 2 years in a row, building a functioning wind turbine system that caught the attention of renewable energy companies, Richard's response was, "That's nice, son. Don't forget to clean up your workspace when you're done." The college visits told the whole story in stark relief. During Jonathan's senior year, Richard took him on a tour of Ivy League schools, spending thousands of dollars on hotels, flights, and experiences that might help Jonathan's applications. They visited Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Columbia, staying in 5-star hotels and dining at exclusive restaurants near each campus. When it came time for Marcus to look at colleges, Richard handed him a 888 travel guide and suggested he do some research online first to narrow down his options. The implication was clear. If Marcus wanted to visit schools, he'd need to figure out how to afford it himself. But perhaps the most insidious part of the discrimination was how it was disguised. As concern for Marcus's character, Richard would often say things like, "I don't want to spoil the boy. He needs to learn the value of hard work." This was usually said while Jonathan sat nearby playing video games on equipment that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Marcus is different," Richard would explain to his friends when they noticed the disparity in treatment. "He's got that immigrant work ethic. Never mind that I was third-generation American. He doesn't need things handed to him like some kids do. He's tougher than that." It was a masterful manipulation, really. Richard managed to turn his neglect of Marcus into a virtue, his favoritism toward his biological children into a character-building exercise. And because Marcus never complained, never threw tantrums, never demanded equal treatment, Richard's narrative went unchallenged. The extended family followed Richard's lead without question. At family gatherings, Marcus was consistently overlooked in conversations about future plans and achievements. When Uncle Thomas asked Jonathan about his college prospects, he'd turn to Marcus and ask, "And what about you? Still thinking about community college?" The tone wasn't malicious exactly, but it carried the clear assumption that Marcus's aspirations should be smaller, more realistic, more appropriate for someone of his circumstances. Cousin Elizabeth's wedding was a perfect example of how deeply the family had internalized this hierarchy. Jonathan and Sophia were invited to be in the wedding party, Jonathan as a groomsman, Sophia as a bridesmaid. Marcus and I received invitations to the ceremony, but not the rehearsal dinner. We were welcome to witness the event, but we weren't considered close enough family to participate in the intimate celebrations. At the reception, the seating chart told its own story. The head table included all the real Hartwells: Richard, Jonathan, Sophia, Richard's siblings, and their children. Marcus and I were seated at table 12 near the back, with family friends and plus ones of distant relatives. When the DJ asked for family members to join the bride and groom for the anniversary dance, Marcus watched from our distant table as the Hartwell clan took the dance floor without him. The most heartbreaking part was watching Marcus adapt to this treatment. He developed a kind of emotional camouflage, making himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. He learned to anticipate exclusion and prepare for it. Before family events, he'd bring a book or a small project to work on, something to occupy himself. During the inevitable moments when the conversation turned to family matters that didn't include him, he stopped asking questions about family history or traditions after Richard's sister Margaret snapped at him once for being too curious about things that don't concern him. He stopped volunteering information about his achievements after it became clear that they made the other adults uncomfortable, as if his success somehow highlighted their children's mediocrity. By the time Marcus was 17, he had perfected the art of being present but invisible, contributing but not competing, achieving but not celebrating. He had learned to be grateful for scraps and to never, ever ask for more than he was offered. But I was watching, and I was keeping score. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment when my brilliant, kind, extraordinary son was treated as less than worthy of the Hartwell name, I filed it all away, because I knew that someday, somehow, the bill would come due. I just never imagined that Marcus was keeping his own accounting, and that his calculations were far more precise and devastating than mine could ever be. The MIT acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, delivered by regular mail in a thick envelope that made my hands shake as I signed for it. Marcus was at his job at Patterson's Hardware, where he'd been working 20 hours a week for the past 2 years, saving every penny while maintaining a perfect GPA and conducting independent research that most graduate students would struggle to understand. I held that envelope for 3 hours, afraid to open it even though the thickness was a good sign. When Marcus finally came home, grease under his fingernails from helping customers with lawnmower repairs, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the letter placed precisely in the center, like a sacred artifact. "Is that?" he started, then stopped. Marcus had learned not to get his hopes up too high about anything in this house. "I waited for you," I said, sliding the envelope across the table. His hands were steadier than mine as he opened it. I watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment when disbelief gave way to amazement, then to something that looked almost like relief. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Mom, I got in. Full scholarship. They want me for their renewable energy research program." I cried then, the kind of ugly, overwhelming sobs that come from years of held breath finally being released. My son, my brilliant, overlooked, underestimated son, had earned his way into one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Not through connections or family money or legacy admissions, but through pure intelligence and determination. That night, I called Richard at his office to share the news. He was in the middle of a client dinner, but I was too excited to wait. "Richard, you'll never believe what happened. Marcus got into MIT, full scholarship." There was a pause. Then, "MIT? That's quite an achievement. We'll talk about it when I get home." But when he got home 3 hours later, he seemed to have forgotten about the conversation entirely. He went straight to his study to review portfolios, and when I brought it up again, he just nodded and said, "Yes, very impressive. We should discuss the practical aspects soon." The practical aspects. As if my son's acceptance to MIT was a minor, logistical problem to be solved rather than a triumph to be celebrated. The next morning, I woke up energized with plans. I wanted to call everyone, to shout from rooftops, to throw a party that would make Jonathan's birthday celebrations look modest by comparison. This was it. This was our moment to finally definitively prove that Marcus belonged in this family, that he was worthy of every investment, every opportunity, every ounce of pride they'd ever shown Jonathan and Sophia. Richard was reading the financial section over coffee when I bounced into the kitchen. "I was thinking we should have a celebration dinner," I said. "Maybe invite the whole family? I know your sister Margaret would love to hear about Marcus's acceptance, and Uncle Thomas is always asking about the kids' academic progress." Richard looked at me over his newspaper with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Victoria. It's a nice achievement, but MIT is expensive. Even with a scholarship, there are costs. But that's what the family college fund is for, right? I mean, this is exactly the kind of situation it was designed for. The silence that followed was long enough for me to pour myself coffee, add cream, and take 2 sips before Richard finally spoke. The college fund is a family resource, Victoria. It needs to be allocated thoughtfully. Something cold settled in my stomach. What do you mean? I mean that Marcus is a smart boy, but we need to consider whether MIT is really the right fit for him. It's a very demanding environment, very competitive. Students there come from a certain background, have certain advantages that might make it difficult for someone like Marcus to succeed. Someone like Marcus? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Richard folded his newspaper carefully, the way he did when he was preparing to have an uncomfortable conversation. Marcus has done well in his local high school, but MIT is different. It's not just about being smart. It's about having the right foundation, the right preparation, the right social capital. I'd hate to see him struggle or feel out of place. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. Are you saying you don't think he should go? I'm saying we should consider alternatives. There are excellent state schools, community colleges with strong transfer programs, places where Marcus could thrive without the pressure of trying to compete with students who've had every advantage since birth. The kitchen felt like it was tilting. Richard, this is MIT. They don't accept students who can't handle the work. They chose Marcus out of thousands of applicants because he's exceptional. He's exceptional for his circumstances, Richard said, and there it was. The qualifier that reduced everything Marcus had achieved to a participation trophy. But exceptional in Riverside isn't the same as exceptional at MIT. I felt something fundamental shift inside me in that moment. For 12 years, I'd made excuses for Richard's treatment of Marcus. I'd told myself that he was just being protective, that he wanted Marcus to develop character, that his expectations were different, but not lesser. But standing in that kitchen, listening to him systematically dismantle my son's greatest achievement, I finally understood the truth. Richard didn't see Marcus as family. He never had. Marcus was a project, a charity case, someone to be managed and contained rather than celebrated and supported. And all my years of gratitude, all my careful navigation of family dynamics, all my desperate attempts to make us fit into their world, none of it had mattered. That afternoon, I found Marcus in his room, surrounded by MIT brochures and course catalogs, planning his future with the methodical intensity he brought to everything. He looked up when I knocked, his face bright with excitement. "Mom, look at this renewable energy program. They're doing work on next-generation solar cells that could revolutionize the entire industry. And the professors, some of these guys literally wrote the textbooks I've been studying." I sat on his bed, watching him glow with possibility, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Richard's doubt poison this moment. "Tell me everything," I said. For 2 hours, Marcus walked me through his plans, his research interests, his dreams for what he could accomplish at MIT. He showed me the dorm he'd requested, the labs he hoped to work in, the professors he wanted to study under. He had it all mapped out with the precision of an engineer and the passion of someone who'd finally found his calling. "The only thing I'm worried about," he said finally, "is the cost. I know the scholarship covers tuition and most expenses, but there are still books, lab fees, travel costs." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Don't worry about that," I said quickly. "Richard mentioned the family college fund. That's exactly what it's for." Marcus nodded, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He'd lived in this house long enough to understand that nothing came easily for us, that every benefit had to be earned twice over and justified 3 times. 3 days later, Richard suggested we discuss Marcus's college plans as a family over dinner. Jonathan and Sophia would be there. Jonathan was home from his job at Richard's firm, and Sophia was visiting with her new fiancé. "It'll be good to get everyone's perspective," Richard said. I should have seen it coming. I should have recognized the setup, the way Richard positioned himself as the reasonable patriarch making difficult decisions for the good of the family. But I was still naive enough to believe that Marcus's acceptance to MIT would speak for itself, that even Richard couldn't dismiss an achievement that spectacular. I was wrong. The dinner that followed became the moment that everything changed, the catalyst that transformed my quiet, patient son into someone I barely recognized. Because when Richard finally revealed his true feelings about Marcus's worth, about his place in the Hartwell family, about his right to the same opportunities, as Jonathan and Sophia, something in Marcus broke, or maybe it didn't break. Maybe it crystallized. Maybe all those years of observation and calculation finally reached their inevitable conclusion, and my son realized that he was done playing by their rules. Either way, the boy who sat quietly through that dinner, absorbing Richard's casual cruelty with apparent grace, was not the same person who would walk across the graduation stage 2 months later. The transformation had begun. After that devastating family dinner at the country club, where Richard's words hung in the air like poison gas, something shifted in Marcus that I'd never seen before. The ride home was silent except for the hum of the Mercedes engine, but I could feel the energy radiating from my son, not the defeated energy of someone who'd been crushed, but the focused intensity of someone who'd just discovered their purpose. When we got home, Marcus went straight to his room without a word. I expected to hear crying, or maybe the sound of him throwing things in frustration. Instead, I heard the quiet clicking of his laptop keyboard, steady and rhythmic, like Morse code tapping out a message to the future. The next morning, I found him at the kitchen table before sunrise, surrounded by notebooks, printouts, and his laptop. He was writing something, but when I approached, he closed the notebook casually, as if it were just homework. "You're up early," I said, pouring coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, but there was something different in his voice, a calmness that seemed almost unnatural after what had happened the night before. "I've been thinking about graduation." "What about it?" He looked up at me with those dark eyes that had always been too old for his face, and smiled. It wasn't the polite, careful smile he used around Richard's family. It was something else entirely, confident, almost predatory. "I think it's going to be more interesting than people expect." Over the next few weeks, Marcus threw himself into preparations for graduation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But it wasn't just about the ceremony itself. He was planning something bigger, something that required research, coordination, and perfect timing. He started staying after school every day, ostensibly to work with Mrs. Rodriguez, the senior class advisor, on his valedictorian speech. When I asked him about it, he'd just say they were fine-tuning the content and change the subject. But I noticed he was coming home with more than just speech notes. He had yearbooks from previous years, programs from past graduation ceremonies, even old newspaper clippings about notable Riverside High graduations. "Research for historical context," he explained when I asked about the pile of materials on his desk. "I want to understand what makes a graduation speech memorable." At the same time, Marcus began reaching out to people in ways he never had before. He started having long conversations with his teachers, particularly Mr. Hendricks, who taught advanced placement physics, and Ms. Chen, his AP English teacher. These weren't casual chats. They were intensive discussions that often ran late, into the evening, based on the timestamps of the emails I occasionally glimpsed on his laptop screen. He also began connecting with his classmates in a systematic way that seemed almost scientific. Marcus had always been well-liked but somewhat solitary at school, the brilliant kid who helped everyone with their homework but rarely socialized outside of academic settings. Suddenly, he was having lunch with different groups every day, joining study sessions, even participating in senior class planning meetings. "I'm trying to be more involved," he told me when I commented on his newfound social engagement. "I realized I've been too focused on my own work. It's important to be part of the community." But I could see there was more to it than that. Marcus was collecting information about his classmates' families, their post-graduation plans, their relationships with the broader Riverside community. He was building a database of connections and influence that seemed far more sophisticated than typical teenage social networking. The most telling change was in how he handled interactions with Richard's family. Where before Marcus had been quiet and deferential during family gatherings, now he engaged actively in conversations about business, politics, and community affairs. He asked thoughtful questions about Richard's work, about Jonathan's responsibilities at the investment firm, about Sophia's wedding planning. Richard seemed pleased by this development. "The boy's finally showing some maturity," he commented. To me, after a Sunday dinner where Marcus had spent 20 minutes discussing market trends with Uncle Thomas. Maybe he's starting to understand how the real world works. What Richard didn't realize was that Marcus was conducting reconnaissance. Every conversation was carefully designed to extract information about the family's business relationships, their social connections, their vulnerabilities. Marcus was mapping the Hartwell family's entire ecosystem with the precision of a military strategist planning an assault. Meanwhile, he continued his routine at Patterson's Hardware, but even there, something had changed. Mr. Patterson, the elderly owner who had been like a grandfather figure to Marcus, mentioned to me that Marcus had been asking unusual questions about the store's customer base. "He wants to know about all the contractors who shop here, the local business owners, who's connected to who in the community," Mr. Patterson told me with a puzzled smile. I told him he's got the mind of a born entrepreneur. Kid's probably already planning his first business venture. But I was beginning to suspect Marcus's interests went beyond entrepreneurship. He was constructing something, a web of relationships and information that would serve a purpose I couldn't yet identify. 3 weeks before graduation, Marcus asked me to help him with an unusual request. He needed me to use my connections, from my catering work to get contact information for specific people in the community: the editor of the Riverside Gazette, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, several prominent local business owners who had been clients of Elegant Affairs. "It's for a senior project," he explained. "We're supposed to interview community leaders about their advice for graduating students." The explanation made sense, but something about the specific people he'd chosen struck me as odd. They weren't just random community leaders. They were people with influence, people who controlled narratives, people who could amplify a message if they chose to. When I delivered the contact list, Marcus thanked me with that same unsettling smile and immediately began making phone calls. From my room, I could hear fragments of his conversations. Polite, respectful discussions about community values, about the importance of education, about recognizing and nurturing local talent. But there was something else in his voice during these calls, a subtle confidence that suggested he was positioning himself as more than just another graduating student seeking advice. He was establishing relationships, creating obligations, setting up a network of supporters who would remember him when the time came. The final piece of Marcus's preparation revealed itself 2 days before graduation, when I found him in the garage at midnight, working on something with intense concentration. He had set up a laptop connected to a projector, and he was testing the display on the garage wall, adjusting settings and timing sequences with the mechanical precision he'd always brought to his engineering projects. "What's all this?" I asked. He looked up, startled. I'd caught him off guard for the first time in weeks. For a moment, I saw something in his face that looked almost like fear, as if he'd been discovered in the middle of something forbidden. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he smiled. "Just working on some visual aids for my speech. I want to make sure everything works perfectly." But as I watched him pack up his equipment with careful, practiced movements, I realized that whatever Marcus was planning for graduation day, it was far more complex and ambitious than a simple valedictorian speech. He had spent 2 months building an arsenal of information, relationships, and technical capabilities. My quiet, overlooked son was preparing for war. And based on the methodical way he'd been approaching every detail, I had the feeling that when the battle came, he was going to win decisively. The only question was how much collateral damage he was willing to accept in the process. Graduation. Day dawned crisp and clear. The kind of perfect May morning that makes everything feel possible. The Riverside High Auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with families streaming in from the parking lot carrying flowers, cameras, and the nervous energy that comes with milestone moments. I arrived early to secure good seats, my heart hammering, with a mixture of pride and anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. The Hartwell family arrived exactly 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, fashionably late enough to make an entrance, but not so late as to appear disrespectful. Richard wore his most expensive suit, the charcoal gray one he reserved for important client meetings. Jonathan and Sophia flanked him like matching bookends, both dressed in designer outfits that probably cost more than most families spent on graduation gifts. They filed into the third row without acknowledging me, settling into their seats with the casual assumption that the best spots were naturally theirs. Richard nodded curtly in my direction, the minimal recognition he offered whenever we were in public together, enough to maintain appearances without suggesting actual warmth. I had saved them seats, of course. Despite everything, despite Richard's dismissal of Marcus's college fund request, despite years of watching them treat my son as a second-class family member, I still played my role as the grateful wife who understood her place in the hierarchy. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the usual graduation day excitement. I kept scanning the crowd, noticing faces I recognized from around town, more community leaders than usually attended high school graduations. Mr. Hendricks, the AP physics teacher, was setting up what looked like recording equipment near the stage. Mrs. Rodriguez kept checking her phone and glancing toward the wings where the graduates were assembled. The ceremony began with the traditional pomp and circumstance, 200 graduating seniors filing onto the stage in alphabetical order. When Marcus appeared in the procession, I felt that familiar surge of maternal pride. He looked confident, composed, carrying himself with a dignity that seemed to add inches to his height. The gold valedictorian cord draped across his graduation gown caught the stage lights, marking him as the academic star he'd always been. The first part of the ceremony followed the usual script: welcome remarks from the principal, recognition of various academic achievements, presentation of scholarships. When they announced Marcus's MIT acceptance and full scholarship, there was polite applause from the audience. I clapped enthusiastically, turning to beam at Richard, but he was checking his watch as if calculating how much longer this would take. Then came the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Principal Morrison stepped to the podium to introduce the valedictorian speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present Marcus Chen, our class valedictorian, who will be attending MIT this fall to study renewable energy engineering. Marcus has been an exceptional student and an integral part of our school community. Please join me in welcoming him to share some thoughts with his fellow graduates and their families. Marcus walked to the podium with measured steps, carrying a tablet instead of the traditional printed speech. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the packed auditorium, and smiled. It was the same confident, almost predatory smile I'd seen in our kitchen 2 months earlier. And suddenly I understood that whatever was about to happen, Marcus had been planning it down to the smallest detail. Thank you, Principal Morrison, distinguished faculty, proud families, and my fellow graduates, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. When I was asked to speak today about our journey and our future, I spent a lot of time thinking about what makes someone truly successful in life. Standard valedictorian opening. The audience settled in, expecting the usual inspirational platitudes about following dreams and working hard. But I noticed that Marcus had subtly shifted his position so that he was facing not just the graduating class, but the entire audience. His eyes swept across the crowd, making contact with specific individuals I now realized were the people he'd been calling for weeks. "I've learned that success isn't just about individual achievement," Marcus continued. "It's about understanding systems, how they work, who controls them, and how they can be improved." He paused, letting that word hang in the air with deliberate emphasis. Something in his tone made Richard straighten in his seat. Jonathan looked up from his phone. Sophia stopped whispering to her fiancé. "For example," Marcus said, touching his tablet to advance to his first slide, "let's talk about educational opportunity and how it's distributed in our community." The large screens flanking the stage lit up with a presentation that was definitely not part of the standard graduation ceremony program. The first slide showed a detailed breakdown of college acceptance rates and scholarship awards for Riverside High students over the past 5 years, organized by family income levels. "As you can see," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture, "there's a strong correlation between family wealth and educational outcomes. But what's interesting is when we look at the exceptions, students who achieve at the highest levels despite economic disadvantages." The next slide showed a comparison chart. On one side, Jonathan Hartwell's academic record, his GPA, SAT scores, and college acceptance, Yale, legacy admission. On the other side, Marcus's record, higher GPA, higher test scores, MIT acceptance with full scholarship, plus a list of his research achievements and awards. A murmur went through the audience. People were leaning forward, suddenly very interested, in what had started as a routine graduation speech. "Now, this raises an interesting question about investment and return," Marcus said, advancing to the next slide. "If we're looking at education as a financial decision, and many families do, what represents the better investment?" The slide showed projected lifetime earnings for graduates of different universities and programs. MIT engineering graduates consistently out-earned Yale business graduates by significant margins. Richard's face had gone pale. He was staring at the screen like he was watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away but desperately wanting to stop what was happening. "But of course," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying just a hint of steel, "investment decisions aren't always made based purely on financial projections. Sometimes they're made based on other factors: personal preferences, family politics, assumptions about worth and potential." The next slide was devastating in its simplicity. It showed the Hartwell Family College Fund disbursements over the past 10 years. Jonathan's full tuition to Yale, Sophia's art school expenses, and various cousins' educational costs. At the bottom, in bold red letters, was a single line, item, Marcus Chen, $0. The auditorium had gone completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic from the parking lot, but not a single whisper from the crowd of 800 people. "Some of you might be wondering why I'm sharing this information," Marcus said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the auditorium with absolute clarity. "It's because I want to talk about what happens when you're told you're not worth investing in. When you're dismissed as not the right material for success." He looked directly at Richard then, and I saw my stepfather's face crumble as he realized that Marcus had heard everything, remembered everything, and had been planning this moment of public accountability for months. When someone tells you that you don't have the right foundation, the right preparation, the right social capital to succeed, Marcus continued, you have two choices. You can accept their assessment and limit your dreams accordingly, or you can prove them so spectacularly wrong that they're forced to confront their own biases and assumptions. The final slide appeared on the screens and it took my breath away. It was an acceptance letter, but not the MIT one we all knew about. This was from the Department of Energy, offering Marcus a paid research position working on a renewable energy project that would begin immediately after his freshman year. The letterhead made it clear this wasn't just any internship. This was a program that typically recruited graduate students and young professionals. I chose option 2, Marcus said simply. And I want every student in this audience who has ever been told they're not enough, not the right fit, not worth the investment, to know that other people's limitations are not your limitations. Their assumptions about your potential are not facts about your future. He stepped back from the podium, and the applause that erupted was unlike anything I'd ever heard at a graduation ceremony. It started with the students, who leaped to their feet in recognition of what they'd just witnessed, then spread to the parents, then to the faculty, until the entire auditorium was on its feet delivering a standing ovation that went on for nearly 3 minutes. I looked at Richard, who was still, sitting, his face ashen, his hands gripped tightly in his lap. Around him, even his own family members were slowly rising to join the applause, unable to resist the pull of Marcus's moment of triumph. But Marcus wasn't done. As the applause finally died down, he returned to the microphone for one final comment. "I'd like to thank everyone who supported me on this journey," he said, his voice now warm with genuine gratitude. "My teachers, my classmates, my employer, Mr. Patterson, and especially my mother, who believed in me when believing was difficult." He paused, looked directly at Richard one more time, and delivered his closing line with the precision of a surgeon, making the final incision. As for those who chose not to invest in my potential, well, I hope you'll consider this a lesson in market analysis. Sometimes the best opportunities come in packages you don't expect. The moment Marcus stepped away from the podium, the auditorium erupted into chaos unlike anything Riverside High had ever witnessed. The standing ovation that had started as polite appreciation transformed into something electric, almost revolutionary. Students were cheering, parents were wiping away tears, and I could see phones everywhere, dozens of people recording, texting, sharing what they'd just witnessed. Principal Morrison looked shell-shocked as he returned to the podium to continue the ceremony. He kept glancing at Marcus, who had resumed his seat among the other graduates with the calm composure of someone who had just completed a carefully calculated mission. The principal stumbled through the remaining formalities, diploma presentations, final remarks, the traditional cap toss, but everyone in that auditorium knew they'd just witnessed the real conclusion to the ceremony. I couldn't take my eyes off Richard. He sat frozen in his seat like a man who'd just watched his house burn down. His usual commanding presence had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked older, smaller, diminished. Jonathan kept shooting worried glances at his father, while Sophia sat rigid with the mortified expression of someone whose family secrets had just been broadcast to 800 people. As the graduates filed off the stage and families began to mingle, I watched a fascinating social phenomenon unfold around Richard. People who had spent years deferring to his opinions, seeking his approval, treating him as the unofficial patriarch of Riverside's business community, were now keeping their distance, not avoiding him entirely. That would have been too obvious. But there was a subtle shift in the social dynamics, like watching a king discover that his crown was made of cardboard. Meanwhile, Marcus was surrounded. Teachers, classmates, parents I barely recognized were clustering around him, shaking his hand, asking questions, requesting selfies. Mrs. Rodriguez was beaming as she introduced him to visitors from the school district office. Mr. Hendricks was showing his recording equipment to someone who appeared to be from the local newspaper. Victoria! I turned to see Margaret, Richard's sister, approaching with her husband Thomas. Her usual perfectly composed expression was cracked with something. That might have been panic. "We need to talk to you about what just happened up there." "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Well, it was..." She struggled for words. "It was very dramatic, very public. People are going to have questions about the family, about private matters that were never meant to be discussed in a forum like this." Thomas nodded gravely. "The boy has put Richard in a very difficult position. There are business relationships to consider, community standing. This kind of spectacle could have consequences." I looked at them, these people who had spent 12 years treating my son as an afterthought, who had nodded approvingly when Richard dismissed Marcus as not Hartwell material, and felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "You're right," I said quietly. "Actions do have consequences." Before they could respond, I walked away toward the crowd surrounding Marcus. As I approached, I heard fragments of conversation that made my heart swell with pride and vindication. Most impressive presentation I've seen from a high school student. That Department of Energy position is incredibly competitive. Takes real courage to speak truth like that. That family should be ashamed of themselves. Marcus caught sight of me and excused himself from his admirers. When he reached me, I expected to see triumph in his eyes, maybe relief, possibly even regret for having gone so public with our family's private dysfunction. Instead, I saw something much more complex. A mixture of satisfaction, exhaustion, and what looked almost like sadness. "How do you feel?" I asked him. He considered the question seriously, the way he always did. "Lighter," he said finally. "Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time and I finally got to put it down." "Any regrets? About the presentation?" "No." "About it having to come to this?" He glanced over at Richard, who was now standing, alone by the auditorium wall, checking his phone with the desperate focus of someone trying to appear busy. Maybe. That's when the media attention really began. The local newspaper reporter, Janet Walsh, whom I recognized from various community events, approached us with her notebook ready. "Marcus, I'm Janet from the Riverside Gazette. That was quite a speech. Would you be willing to answer a few questions about your presentation?" "Of course," Marcus replied, slipping effortlessly into interview mode. "The data you presented about educational funding disparities. Where did that come from?" "Public records, mostly. School district reports, university admissions statistics, some information from state education databases. All publicly available if you know where to look. And the personal financial information about the Hartwell Family College Fund?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "I only presented information about funds that directly affected my own educational opportunities. I believe transparency about educational access is important for community discussion." Janet scribbled notes rapidly. "Some people might say that sharing private family information in such a public forum was inappropriate. I think," Marcus said carefully, "that when private decisions have public implications, when they affect how community resources are allocated, how talent is recognized and supported, then those decisions become legitimate subjects for public discussion." I watched him handle the interview with the same methodical precision he'd brought to his speech, answering every question without ever saying anything that could be construed as illegal or unethical. He was protecting himself legally while making his moral point crystal clear. As the interview concluded, I noticed Richard finally approaching us. He looked haggard, like someone who'd been awake for days. When he reached us, he ignored the reporter and focused entirely on Marcus. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we've said everything that needed to be said," Marcus replied calmly. "You humiliated me in front of the entire community. You've damaged relationships that took decades to build. You've made me look like—" Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Like some kind of villain." Marcus studied his stepfather with those dark, analytical eyes. "I didn't make you anything, Richard. I just showed people what was already there." The crowd around us had grown quiet, sensing the tension. Richard glanced around at the faces watching him, then back at Marcus. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and for the first time in 12 years, I heard something in Richard's voice I'd never heard before. Vulnerability. Marcus considered the question for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't want anything from you anymore. That's the point." Finality in those words seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. He looked around the auditorium one more time, taking in the small groups of people who were clearly discussing what they'd witnessed. the disapproving glances from community members he'd considered friends, the general atmosphere of social reckoning that Marcus had created. Without another word, Richard turned and walked toward the exit. Jonathan and Sophia hurried after him, leaving me standing there with Marcus as the last echoes of the graduation ceremony faded away. "The Department of Energy position," I said quietly. "When did that happen?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time all day it reached his eyes. "3 days ago. I was going to tell you tonight, after all this was over." "So when you planned your speech?" I didn't know about the DOE opportunity yet. But I knew that whatever happened after today, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd spoken up. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized that the boy who had walked into this auditorium a few hours earlier was gone forever. In his place was a young man who understood exactly how power worked, who had the courage to challenge it when necessary, and who would never again allow himself to be made small by someone else's limitations. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's speech would ripple through Riverside for months to come. But in that moment, walking beside my son in the late afternoon sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 years, the absolute certainty that we were finally, completely free. 6 months later, I stood in Marcus's dorm room at MIT, helping him hang pictures on the wall, awards from his first semester, a photo of us at his high school graduation, and a framed copy of the email that had started it all. Not the MIT acceptance letter, but the message from Dr. Sarah Kim at the Department of Energy, congratulating him on his groundbreaking research proposal and formally offering him the paid position that would run concurrent with his studies. "Mom, you don't have to organize my entire room," Marcus said, laughing as I rearranged his bookshelf for the 3rd time. But I could hear the affection in his voice. These visits had become precious to both of us, not just because we missed each other, but because they represented something we'd never had before, the luxury of time together without walking on eggshells. Marcus had thrived at MIT in ways that went beyond academics, though his grades were predictably excellent. His professors had quickly recognized his potential, and he was already working on research that graduate students typically didn't access until their 3rd year. But more importantly, he'd found his tribe, other brilliant, driven students, who valued innovation over inheritance, merit over connections. "Tell me about the project again," I said, settling into his desk chair while he sprawled on his narrow dorm bed. His eyes lit up the way they always did when he talked about his work. "We're developing a new type of solar cell that can harvest energy from both direct sunlight and ambient light, even indoors. The applications could be revolutionary. Imagine powering entire buildings with panels that work efficiently, even on cloudy days, or in places where traditional solar isn't viable. And the Department of Energy thinks this could actually work? They're investing $2 million in our research team, so yes, they think it could work." He grinned. "Dr. Kim says if our early trials are successful, we could be looking at patent applications by my junior year." As I listened to him describe his work, I marveled at the transformation that had taken place. Not just in Marcus, though watching him speak with confidence about his achievements without apologizing or diminishing them was extraordinary, but in myself. For the first time in decades, I wasn't calculating how his success might be received by others. Wasn't worried about making anyone uncomfortable with our accomplishments. The changes back in Riverside had been dramatic and swift. Within a week of graduation, the video of Marcus's speech had gone viral locally, shared across social media platforms with captions like, "Student calls out family's hypocrisy," and "When merit meets money." The Riverside Gazette had run a feature story about educational equity, using Marcus's presentation as a launching point for broader community discussion. Richard's response had been to retreat entirely from public life. He'd resigned from the Chamber of Commerce, stopped attending community events, and according to the gossip network that still reached me through my former catering contacts, had become something of a hermit. Jonathan had quietly transferred to a different investment firm in another city. Sophia had moved up her wedding date and relocated to her fiancé's hometown in Connecticut. The Hartwell family gatherings had simply stopped. No more formal dinners. No more holiday celebrations. No more awkward attempts to maintain the facade of family unity. In their absence, I'd discovered something remarkable. I didn't miss them. The anxiety I'd carried for 12 years, the constant vigilance required to navigate their approval and disapproval, had simply evaporated. "Have you heard from Richard at all?" Marcus asked, as if reading my thoughts. "Nothing direct, but Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he'd stopped by the hardware store last week." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Really? What did he want?" "According to her, he spent 20 minutes asking about you, how you were doing at MIT, whether you were happy, if you needed anything." I paused, choosing my words carefully. She said he looked smaller, somehow. Older. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out his window at the Cambridge campus beyond. "Do you think I was too harsh?" he asked finally. It was a question he'd asked several times over the past months, usually during our phone calls late at night when the weight of what he'd done seemed to settle on him most heavily. "No," I said, and I meant it completely. "You told the truth. If the truth was harsh, that's because the situation was harsh. You spent 12 years being treated as less than worthy by people who should have celebrated every one of your achievements. You gave them countless opportunities to see you, to value you, to invest in you. They chose not to. But destroying his reputation, his standing in the community." "Marcus." I waited until he looked at me. "You didn't destroy anything. You revealed something that was already there. Richard made choices about how to treat you, how to allocate family resources, how to define worth and belonging. Those choices had consequences. You just made those consequences visible." He nodded slowly, but I could see he was still processing, still working through the complex emotions that come with taking a stand that changes everything. "Besides," I added, "look what you've built instead of focusing on what he lost. You're conducting research that could change how the world generates clean energy. You're mentoring high school students through that STEM outreach program. You're living proof that talent and determination matter more than family connections or inherited wealth." That was true. Marcus had channeled his experience into advocacy work, volunteering with organizations that helped first-generation college students navigate higher education. He'd become particularly passionate about mentoring kids from working-class families, who showed promise in STEM fields, but lacked the resources and guidance that wealthier students took for granted. "There's something else," Marcus said, reaching for his laptop. "I've been invited to speak at the National Education Equity Conference next spring. They want me to present about systemic barriers to educational opportunity and how individual courage can create broader change." "Marcus, that's incredible." The organizer said my graduation speech had been circulated in education policy circles as an example of how personal storytelling can illuminate structural problems. He showed me the email, and I could see his excitement building as he talked about it. "It's a chance to reach thousands of educators, administrators, policymakers, to maybe help other students who are facing what I faced." As I read the conference invitation, I realized that Marcus's graduation day confrontation hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, the first step in a journey that was transforming him from someone who had been dismissed and undervalued into someone who could speak for others in similar situations. We spent the rest of my visit walking around Cambridge, talking about his classes, his research, his plans for the future. But what struck me most was how present he was, how fully engaged with his life. For years, Marcus had seemed to be holding part of himself in reserve, as if he were waiting for permission to fully inhabit his own potential. That reservation was gone now. On my last evening there, we had dinner at a small restaurant near campus. As we talked, I found myself thinking about the question that had haunted me for months. Whether I should have intervened earlier. Whether I should have protected Marcus from the Hartwell family's treatment, instead of hoping they would eventually come around. "I need to apologize to you," I said suddenly. Marcus looked up from his pasta, surprised. "For what?" "For not standing up for you sooner. For letting you carry that burden alone for so many years. For choosing my own comfort over your dignity." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Mom, if you had fought that battle for me, I never would have learned how to fight it for myself. I needed to find my own voice, my own power. You gave me something more valuable than protection. You gave me the foundation to protect myself." That night, as I flew back to Riverside, I thought about the advice I would give to other parents, other families, other young people who might be facing similar situations. The story that had started with exclusion and dismissal had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of truth-telling, the importance of knowing your own worth, and the possibility of transformation even in the most difficult circumstances. Marcus had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve. Not out of arrogance or entitlement, but out of a deep understanding that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. 6 months after graduation day, my son was exactly where he belonged, not because someone had given him permission to be there, but because he had claimed his place through talent, determination, and the courage to speak his truth when it mattered most. If you've ever been told you're not enough, if you've ever been excluded from opportunities that should have been yours, if you've ever had to choose between staying quiet and standing up for yourself, remember Marcus's story. Remember that other people's limitations are not your limitations. Their assumptions about your potential are not facts about your future. And sometimes, the most perfect revenge is simply becoming everything they said you could never be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.